Our guest this evening is a retired associate professor of criminology and sociology at John Carroll University from Cleveland, Ohio. Outside of his work as a professor and a teacher, he is also an exquisite author who is finishing his first book. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest, Ernest Dezolt. Ernie, pleasure to have you here.
Rex, thank you.
I'm your host, Rex Larkman, and welcome to Our Talks. Ernie, glad to have you here. I'm going to start with an intro question. From my understanding, you've been writing from a very young age. Is this true?
That's correct, yes.
What kind of writings did you do as a younger kid, or what kind of sparked your interest in writing?
I'm not sure what sparked my interest in writing, only that I always had a unique interest in people and how they thought, how they acted. So early on, it was more just taking notes. I would hear something, I'd write it down that I thought was interesting, or I would see something and I would write it down. Then that turned into what probably could be called short poems that helped me to record that moment that I experienced. And from there, just a general interest in writing came about.
That's very interesting. Moving forward on that topic of, from a young age, you've been writing and observing people. The title of your memoir is Your Mother is Losing Her Mind, or the working title. And that's pretty powerful. That's a very powerful opening statement for a book if it's on the front cover. Can you explain what that title means and maybe what it means to your childhood?
That's a very interesting question with probably multiple answers to it. What does it mean to me in my childhood? The first thing that it means, and most importantly to me, it's a reminder of how my mom struggled with her emotions, and later with remaining sane, as the medical community would define sanity. But it also is a reminder to me of a childhood that was littered with inconsistencies, with ambiguity, with a lot of not knowing from moment to moment. And I remember how difficult that was as a young boy, because I think we all crave predictability, even if we don't admit it to ourselves or we don't understand it as predictability. So it was living on the edge, on the razor's edge, as other authors have written and discussed it. And that was the feeling. So that title to me is a reminder of the lack of predictability and consistency. It also is a tribute, lastly, it's a tribute to my mom. Not who she was, but what she struggled through, and yet still had the dignity, in my view, to be quite a wonderful mom and always loving. Although her behavior was not always predictable, her love was. And that's a juxtaposition it's hard to appreciate unless you lived it. But I never doubted the total love from my mom, and from my dad for that matter. It was just that the behavior surrounding that love was strange at times.
Interesting. And your book obviously goes through a lot of these events from your childhood and stories that you have. I have a little quote from your memoir here that I'm going to read and ask you maybe a quick question about. Childhood is the time when all that we can become begins. It is a time when we're supposed to be infused with the hope that we can succeed at anything, but sometimes circumstances get in the way. Promises are broken, and you realize that the only promises worth keeping are those that you make to yourself. Now that kind of ties in with a lot of things you were just saying about your mom and consistency in your childhood. And to a casual reader, your story is one that resonates with hopelessness almost. And is that your main message, or what do you want the reader to take away from your first memoir?
It's interesting because it's a play off of hopefulness. And by that I mean, there's no doubt that there were moments in my childhood, probably many if I was truly honest with myself, where I felt utterly hopeless, where I felt as a young boy that I had to be an adult and I didn't know how to do that. And it became overwhelming emotionally sometimes to me, where I felt hopeless, although I never admitted it. I'm very willful, so I never even admitted it as a child. But the message behind the message, or working through the hopelessness, the message that I want to send with this manuscript is, my belief is that all childhoods have their share of pain, ambiguity, uncertainty. And that's a beautiful starting point if we understand that that's not the end of the story, it's the beginning of the story. And it's a way to work through to ultimate hopefulness, because life isn't fair. I'm not sure life is meant to be fair. For those of us who believe their life is fair, wonderful. I see that more as a naive position on life. I think life is demanding. It is experiential. And so take those experiences, even the painful ones, and develop through them. And so I think that is the ultimate message. My hope is for the reader, not that I would ever tell the reader what to think, but that would be how I would see it.
That's awesome. That's really cool. Now, through your book and through the reader gathering themselves in that message, your memoir about childhood deals with the effects of mental illness and family dynamics and personal identity, and trying to find yourself through those times that you feel hopeless. So although you're highly educated in sociology and criminology, and that was what you taught at John Carroll, your training is not in the field of mental health. So what gives you the expertise to kind of exploit all of your information and research that you've possibly done on mental health through your book and to the reader?
That's a fair question. Just as a side note, I did start my academic career in psychology, and I imagined myself, probably fashioned myself as an undergraduate as the next Sigmund Freud. I always dare to think big. And I realized as I was approaching graduate study that there was a lot of value, there is a lot of value in the psychological perspective. But the psychological perspective is vacant outside of the sociological perspective, meaning it's not just about what's going on with you internally or what's going on with me internally. It's what's going on internally within both of us as we sit here as an example tonight. So the environment that we sit in this moment is altering, whether we realize it or not, those internal feelings, emotions, thoughts, etc. So when I got to that point in my thinking, I realized that sociology was where I wanted to go with advanced study. But your point is well taken. I'm not an expert, nor do I claim to be within the memoir. But what I am is a living, breathing example of someone who has survived first, and secondly, thrived within kind of the soup of mental illness, if you will. And it's that story. It's living life without knowing the outcome that is the most powerful way to live life, if you ask me. I was lucky. I didn't plan it that way. I came about it late, but it's the natural evolution of just living through life, embracing ambiguity. If I can take your question in a little different way, that little boy back in Ashtabula, Ohio, all those years ago, would never have imagined himself here. Literally would not have imagined this interaction. So how did it happen, right? And it's just allowing life. I've come to this philosophy, and I'm sure it belongs to somebody else smarter and older than me, but I'm at a point in life, and I got there early, where I don't pretend to live my life. I let my life live me. I just am open to the moment. And all of the pain in my childhood taught me that lesson early on, that I don't have to know what's going to happen in the next moment to be okay in this moment. And before you know it, this moment leads to the next, and you're always okay. I'm always okay. And that's the hopefulness, back to your earlier question. So you're right. There is no professional expertise, but there's a lot of experiential learning that went on and helped me to get to this point.
That's very interesting, because that's kind of how recently, just being a junior in college, I'm starting to gauge my life, living in the moment, letting, like you said, ambiguity kind of just take you. For example, I would never imagine myself here speaking with you, even a year ago. So I'm very grateful to have this conversation with you, and it resonates a lot with my life, not even having read your book, just speaking to you and learning the little things about your past and how you've examined life is very interesting. Now, outside of the message of your book, let's talk about the writing, your writing style. Do you have a kryptonite to your writing? Is there something while you're writing maybe that, I don't know, defeats you? Is there something in writing that, I don't know, makes it hard to write sometimes? Maybe telling the full truth, what's fiction, what's nonfiction? So maybe talk about that a little bit.
Very good question, very powerful question, as you probably know, since it's yours. My kryptonite goes back to your previous question, and it's essentially this: who am I? Who am I as a person? Who am I as an academic to present my childhood to the reader? There, although unintended, there's arrogance in that, and I understand it. Who am I to put my childhood out in front of others to examine and perhaps get something from it, hopefully get something from it? There's still a little bit of arrogance in there. So there's arrogance mixed in with lack of self-esteem. It's interesting, I'm a very willful person. The most willful person I have ever met, and I mean that. But that willfulness comes from a position of not totally believing in myself, as was the case from the time I was that little boy. I guess I carried the little boy forward, to use a visual. I've carried that little boy forward, that anxious, unknowing of what's coming next, fear of being abandoned, fear that mental illness will pull me, uproot me out of my family and put me in a foster home or a children's home, as was the case many, many decades ago. So all of that insecurity, although it fuels me on one hand, it's the kryptonite when I go to write. There was another point I was going to make about writing. Oh, you had asked about identity a moment ago, or you had inferred about identity. Another part of the kryptonite is I don't define myself. I don't identify as a writer. Therefore, writing is a very difficult thing for me to do. I can talk about the social significance of a salt shaker on the spot in front of 1,000 people and be absolutely alluring because it's a gift. As I'm talking with you now, as I communicate, it's nothing I'm doing, it's just who I am. Therefore, it's easy. Therefore, there's no ego. Therefore, I don't care if my communication resonates orally with anyone. But when I sit down to write, what I'm writing is from the inside. What I'm talking about is from the outside. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
As a teacher, as a communicator, I can speak on a variety of issues that I understand that are not part of my identity. I'm not a criminologist. I'm not a sociologist, really, internally, if that makes any sense.
Okay.
But when I write, I'm laying myself wide open. And I know it when I'm doing it, and it's very difficult to do because that identity pops up again. It's like, this is embarrassing to say, but with all due respect to the 10,000 plus students I have taught in my career, and that's a very humbling thought, but the vast majority of those 10,000, if they ever remember having me as a teacher or sharing a class with me, they probably don't have a view one way or another. But even those who disliked the class, or maybe even disliked me, didn't bother me. But what about the first person who reads my story and says, this, I don't like this. Now what they're saying is they don't like me from the inside. And that's a very powerful writer's block possibility.
Yeah.
Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, no, I understand what you're
It's just
saying.
like, oof.
It's the idea of putting your whole life on the line, on the table for people to just
Dissect.
totally dissect, perfect word, and just read through it's frightening.
Yeah.
It's very scary. To take it like personally, with my creative lifestyle that I have, like even doing this, we're putting ourselves out there for people to view. It's a very frightening feeling, but it's also almost a powerful feeling in a good way too. Mm-hmm. Like you put yourself out there, it's nerve-wracking, but you're confident in your work and you're confident in what you have to say, even though you know it might not resonate with everyone.
Right.
I feel like just doing that and putting yourself out there is a healthy thing.
Yes.
And especially with what I know about your past and what you know, what you want to reveal to people.
Exactly.
So,
yes. Something else I'd like to say, and again, your question kind of pushes me in this direction a little. The foreword of the manuscript of the memoir, I indicate to the reader something that I believe is very important, and again, your question hints at this. What I say, words to this effect, that the words written in this manuscript are true. I mean, it's my truth. I experience, it's my story. I experience these things. But the events of that story, because this manuscript is about 72 experiences, stories that I had as a kid that I weave
like
together.
72 short stories, all in like one.
Yes.
What's the time period? What's the like?
From 3 years old to 17.
Wow. That's what this first book kind of
That's it.
takes place. And is it in chronological order, or
It
do
is
you
in
jump
chronological
around?
order. I wrote it. So once I picked out the experiences of my childhood that I wanted to write about, then I put them in chronological order. I have a very powerful memory. I can remember conversations with people when I was 3, and I can record those to you back verbatimly. Wow. I mean, that's just how my mind works.
When you were 3 years old?
From the time I was 3 years old.
That's crazy.
Yes.
That's really cool.
You know, and some folks have said to me teasingly, well, I have a photographic memory. Well, I don't know what that means, really. If you gave me that page to look at in 5 minutes from now, say, well, I couldn't do that. Yeah. But when it comes to events.
Especially like one so extreme as what you kind of go into in your book.
Yes, they're etched in my mind. Wow. But I let the readers know that to protect, that's a strong word, but to protect those in and out of my family who experienced some of these same events, to protect them, and they're alive, with the exception of my parents, so they need protection. I take their names out. So when you read this memoir, you're reading it from an I perspective. Okay. Right? So I don't include names on purpose of family members, of friends. I don't do that for their.
Do you give them like fake names, aliases, or?
No, I don't put names in at all.
Wow. How do you then signify characters or people in these events?
I just say an aunt or an uncle or an older cousin.
An old friend.
Yeah, an older friend.
Old friend 1, old friend 2.
That's something that's the way I do it. And the other thing that I do is take an event that was very powerful, like an episode of nervous breakdown, as they called it in the day in the 60s. I make one event out of multiple scenarios, so I collapse time. Okay. It's still true. What I experienced, but I'm collapsing time a little bit for the sake of the story. So, and then to me, that makes it palatable. And so folks know that they're real, but again, the names are not there, and sometimes I collapse time in on itself just to make the point.
Yeah, you know? Make it fair to the reader, fair to yourself.
Yes, exactly.
Wow, that's really interesting. Moving forward, so far the book sounds relatively, unfortunately, dismal. It's very, the stories that you're sharing sound sad up front. Are there, in these events, are there any good events that you kind of weave in through the activity to try to break through with that message that you're trying to get to the reader?
I think the answer to that is yes. Of course, the reader would have to decide for him or herself. But I think it's ultimately an uplifting memoir. Now, again, that's a biased statement, obviously. But I do believe it's uplifting because through the pain is seen and is offered a lot of hopefulness. So, in a way, to answer your question differently, since it's an I story written from solely my perspective, I help the reader appreciate what's before me, what's before the reader. But all of the internal thinking that's going on with me at all these various ages as I recall that thought process. So the events sometimes are heavy. They are. There's no way around it. But the thought process is different than that because I have always, and it's a gift, I don't know why I was this way. And I'm assuming all children are somewhat this way, but I don't know. It's that indomitable spirit that I was given. I can recall to you as an example one time when my dad's company was on strike and they locked in the workers. Right?
Is this a story you talk about in the book?
Yes, this is a story I talk about in the book. So he's locked in, right, for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. And I could tell my mom was not at a strong point in her life. And I knew, and I write about this, I knew it was only a matter of time before she had another nervous breakdown. I knew when she was going to have them before she knew she was going to have them. I just would follow the pattern. And so, of course, she did. And I talk about the fact that since my dad was not around, in talking with the doctors, and the doctors at that time said, look, your mom is at a risk of literally losing her mind forever, going away to a sanitarium. Sanitarium, I think. I don't know. Sanitarium.
Insane asylum.
An insane asylum. Yes. And I obviously was not prepared to have that.
How old were you when this was?
9 years old.
Wow.
No, I take that back. I was 12 years old.
Okay.
This was the third time she had a nervous breakdown, so I was 12 years old. And there I was in the room with the doctor, and he said to my mother, I want to erase a large part of your brain.
Wow.
He was going to erase it. He said, the fear is the science is so new, the medical science is so new that we might totally erase your mind. So my mom would no longer be, in quotes, mentally ill, whatever that meant at the time, but she wouldn't be her. She wouldn't be Clara. She wouldn't be my mom. She would have no memory of anything. It would be total amnesia, I guess. And so he says it's either that or an insane asylum. And I remember talking to my mom when he left the room. So what he wanted to do is to give my mom a series of shock treatments back to back to back to back to back. And I think at that time, there were different numbers at different times. I think at that time it was 9 in a row.
Wow.
And he said, you have to decide. And my mom was so weak, so disturbed by things. And she says, I don't know what to do. I need to talk to your dad. It's like, we can't talk to dad. We've got to make this decision ourselves. And she goes, well, please don't have them send me away. And I said, well, then, Mom, we've got to do this. And she said, well, I'll do it under one condition, if you are holding my hand when they give me these shock treatments. Now, that sounds like a B-rated Hollywood movie. Yeah. I mean, how is a child going to hold his mother's hand?
A 12-year-old child?
While she's getting electrocuted, essentially. When they jolt you, that body comes off that bed. It's like in the movies. That's for real. And so I felt I had no choice because I wasn't prepared to let her go away. So I sat there with her and I held her hand and they zapped her, 9 times in a row. And to see her eyes roll back in her head, biting down on this orange ball and these electrodes taped to her head, it was something that I will, never forget. And so, again, to your point, there's no way to write about that truthfully without telling it. That's what I saw. But to your question, at the same time, I help the reader appreciate what I'm thinking while I'm experiencing what I'm experiencing. And again, I'm lucky. I don't know why, Rex. But my thought process has always been softer, brighter, to use a modern day term, more spiritual. So I knew it was going to be okay. Wow. I didn't know what okay meant, only that it would be okay. And so I hope in that kind of internal dialogue and narrative, the reader appreciates it. Yeah, it was scary. There's no way. It was scary to see that.
It sounds frightening.
But I saw it as hopefulness. I saw it as getting us further along, and someday it was going to be better than today, and the following day would be better than that day.
It's almost like, unfortunately, saying this, doing something is better than just letting your mom sort of kind of
go away.
Exactly. And even if that's something, like you said, in the moment, you don't know what okay is, you don't know what the future kind of holds for you, but your positivity, which you kind of put in your book, and like the way that these events have changed you and have made you who you are, but you are proud to be who you are, and you're proud of the things that you've accomplished. It is uplifting. It is exciting to read, even with like the changing of emotions. So that's very interesting.
The only thing I would hope for the reader, again, not telling the reader anything of his or her business, but I would hope for the reader that they don't come away thinking that you have to go through pain to be trite about it, to gain pleasure, because that's not the message. Okay. The message is softer than that. The message is life is what it is. Experiences are that. The emotions we attach to experiences are neutral. That's the key. Okay. Experiences are experiences. Facts are facts. Emotions are choices, are labels, are part of the identity that we choose to attach. And I've been lucky to always have the gift of hopefulness, I guess, is the way to put it to your question. Yeah. And that has driven me. So if there's a secondary message for the reader, it's don't give up hope. It's not that pain will lead to gain.
Yeah, don't put yourself, don't try to read what I've gone through and put yourself in a position that is, I don't know, demoralizing almost. Right. Just let life be what it is, whether you're dealt a good hand or bad hand, and just do with the best that you have, I guess. I
would say life always deals a good hand. There is no negative. If I've learned anything, there is no negative. There is no bad. There is no tragedy. There is none. It's just life. And so be careful of the labels we choose to put on things. Best not to put a label. Best to accept, perhaps, if that's a word that others can wrap around. But there is no bad. And I know that's hard to say and it's hard to hear for some people, but I really don't see things. What if, let me put it in a question, what if everything life hands out to us is for our benefit? What then? And that's the way I choose to navigate life. Instead of saying, because otherwise, who am I to even critique my own life? It's like, for those who are religious, to use a label, God, how dare you? What I'm telling God what to give me in terms of my life, for those who are so inclined to see God as a guiding force. You understand the point. It just is. And so if it simply is, then of course it's for my benefit. Of course it's for your benefit. How could it be anything but that? Yeah. But again, I'm lucky that I don't know why, because I was a little boy, and we were poor, and I was not well educated, and I was not a good student. But I was lucky that I always saw life that way.
Okay, everything you're saying is very interesting and very uplifting, but we're going to go to a quick break from our sponsors, and we'll be right back with Ernest Dezolt on his book. And we're back with Ernest Dezolt. Now, Ernie, to wrap up what we've talked about a lot of great topics on your book. For future writings, do you plan to go maybe back to this story in future novels, or other things that you want to delve into on this psychological journey of your writing? What's next for Ernest Dezolt once this book gets released?
Thank you, Rex. To the extent that I have creative say in what comes next, and I may not, what I would like to touch on next, a draft title is Love Poems to Promise. Going back to something you asked me early on, one of the things I've done since I was a young boy is write poems or write segments of poems, kind of like unfinished songs for someone like yourself, ideas. And again, they were a way for me to chronicle what was going on at the time. So I literally have books, little bound notebooks of these writings, these poems. And so back to the title of promise, since I see life as so ultimately promising, the title Love Poems to Promise will take me through, again, different time periods of my life, not just childhood as in this example, but even into adulthood, and examining some of the more pertinent moments of my life. Why are they pertinent? Because I chose to write poems about them. So to go back and string together a manuscript of what I'm calling love poems, although when I wrote them, I wasn't necessarily thinking of love or thinking lovingly. Yeah. But I want to frame it as love poems to promise, because if there's anything any of us have, it's the promise of ourselves, including the promise of our future selves. So I would like to put together a compilation of these poems to promise as I see them having guided my life, or at least recording my life through time. So there's that. I do imagine myself continuing to write short stories. Cool. I don't know about a novel. I'm open to a novel. But beginning, middle, and endings are scripted. And my life is anything but scripted. My thought process is anything but scripted. So it would be harder, I think, for me to write a novel, to put characters in it and to bring them to life. So it's probably much more short stories. A theme that's very important to me is something called spirituality today. And I say something called spirituality because it means different things to different people. But I believe we all have an element of spirituality inside of us, no matter how we define it, how we see it. And so I'd like to keep hitting on that theme. Again, the promise of ourselves. And I think we're all in search of a better version of ourselves. Again, there's that word better. What does that mean? Whatever it means to each person. But I think we're in search of our better selves. And so short stories along that line. And just as another side note, and I don't know that it relates to your question, but something that just blew through my mind. I think each of us, this is something I sense with people, that we're in search of something we once knew and we subsequently forgot. And I mean that at the individual level, I mean that at the familial level, I mean that at the community level, the national level, and the international level. I think we're in search of what we once knew and have forgotten. I don't know how to tease that out more, but it's just something that churns inside of me. So that may be something future.
That's a really cool topic. With this being your first memoir, your first book that you're going to be releasing to the public, coming from my own personal background, my own creative standpoint, I'm a musician. When I released my band's first album, I thought it was the work most represented me. Now, with this first book that you're writing, it's very, very personal with a lot of events from your childhood. When you move into future works, will this be the book that, I don't want to say be most proud of, but maybe reference back to the most? Because these events have had such an impact on your life. If you continue to write about your life in adulthood, you almost have to continuously go back to this. So what I'm asking is, how important is this first novel, or excuse me, this first memoir to you?
Beyond the personal level, which is obvious as we've talked about, from a writer's standpoint, it's ultimately important because whatever I end up writing and whatever ends up getting published, which is out of my control, of course, is always informed by the experiences of my life, therefore always informed by this memoir. No matter what I'm writing about, in a matter of speaking, I'm rewriting the stories of my childhood.
That makes a lot of sense.
Rewriting the promise that my childhood held that was never delivered upon. Rewriting my childhood from a fairy tale perspective, perhaps. I'm not sure how it diverts, but your point is well taken. I think that who I am as a person is this memoir. So how important is it to me? To ask a trite question about an important topic, who is Ernest Dezolt? I don't know. But I know part of who I am is this memoir. Without those stories, I'm not the person sitting before you. I'm sure there's other things in the mix, of course, right? But I am that little boy, and I think I'll always be that little boy, no matter how big an adult I grow into. I'm always going to be that little boy.
Wow.
So,
that's amazing. Now, to conclude, do you have any idea on a release date of when this book will be out to the public? What are you currently working on to get this in people's hands as soon as possible?
Thank you for that question. I am and have been in the process of contacting the top agents across the country and putting in their hands what are called query letters, which is a summation of the manuscript. Also a proposal, which is a 30-page abstract of the larger manuscript, and some sample chapters. So those are going out as we speak and have been going out for a few months. Once an agent decides to represent me, it's likely to take that person, it depends, of course, but it's likely to take that person 3 to 6 months to get a book deal, and then whatever time production takes to get it out. So as we sit here today, it would be wonderful if it got in the public's hands early 2018. That's doable if representation comes in the near future.
Now, Ernie, before this interview, I did a little research on your name online, and I came across your Rate My Professor, which is a website where students can go in and literally rate the professor and let other students know how they taught and stuff before they choose them for a class, and everything was excellent. Like, there were reviews from students all over the place just saying that you were a great teacher, they raved about you, they had a great time in your class, they had a great time learning. Taking that to the writer's perspective, you said that you've taught over 10,000 students, which is a crazy number to think about. All of those classes, all of those hours and assignments and times. How does teaching to that many students connect with being a writer and maybe influence your writing style or influence what you put on the paper from your childhood? Like, do you share these things with maybe your students? Do you kind of reflect upon that in class in any way?
I don't remember ever reflecting a story from my childhood per se. Now again, we're going back almost 40 years, so maybe I'm just forgetting or misremembering, but I don't think I have. But to the first part of your question, how does my teaching affect my writing, if at all? I would have to say, and I've never thought of that question, so thank you. I would have to say it probably frees me up to write, and especially writing this memoir. And here's why. When you're out in front of that number of students, or when you're out in front of even a classroom of 35 students, what you understand as a teacher is that students don't fail the teacher, teachers fail the students. And I don't mean academically. What I mean by that is teachers fail to communicate in a way that different students need to be communicated to and with. And so I have realized over the years, I have failed a large percentage of those 10,000 students by not communicating in a way that was most effective for their learning. What that does in translation to writing, to your question, is to help, in a way, take the pressure off, making me realize that there probably is no way I can write any story in a way that different readers are going to appreciate. So, on one hand, it's scary to have readers read your life, but in another, it's freeing because I know there have to be those for whom these stories do not resonate. That has to be true.
Everyone's different.
Everyone's different, right?
And that makes sense with teaching class. Everyone's
Yes.
different.
Everyone is different.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's interesting.
So if you need a lot of point A to point B, this is what the authors say, this is what your texts are saying, this is what you need to know for the test, I am a horrible teacher for you. If you want to read and think and come into class and talk about all the possible offshoots, then I'm your guy. Wow. And I think that's what I've learned about teaching in almost 40 years.
And does that style of teaching kind of connect to your writing? Do you kind of, the way that you teach in front of an audience, is that the way that you write for an audience as well?
I think the answer to that is yes, from the standpoint that I've had some agents tell me that they've appreciated my writing style, but that it's not conventional. That's their word. And when I ask them what they mean by that, they're coming up with an answer that's similar to your point that you just raised. It's like, I actually had one agent say to me that I write very powerfully, but that I break all the rules. Wow. And I said, I'm not even going to ask you, with all due respect, what the rules are, because even if I know what they are, I'm still going to write the way I write. You know, I only know how to write one way, and I only know how to teach one way. So, but it was interesting to your point that somehow in the literary world, I'm very unconventional in my style, whatever that means to the literary world.
That's almost more fun.
Yeah.
It makes it more fun for you. It makes it different for agents and people to read, so it makes it a very unique experience, experiencing your life with you, which is only something that books and stories written by an author can do. So anyone watching that would like to follow Ernest Dezolt, all of his handles are at Ernest Dezolt, correct? He's on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. If you want to contact him with more information, his Gmail is at ernestdezolt@gmail.com. Thank you, Ernie, so much for...
I appreciate it. Thank you, Rex.
This has been fantastic. I'm Rex Larkman for Our Talks, and thanks for watching.